All right, we're here today with Kevin Crace. How you doing, Kevin?
I'm doing very well, Mr. Southpaw.
You got it down. Now, some background for the listeners. In the early to mid-90s, there was this record label called Humbug, which I love. Some of my favorite songwriters together on this label. And I didn't discover it till a bit later on, you know, being in America and all. But there isn't too much information on the internet about Humbug, so I thought I would come to the source. And Kevin ran Humbug, so who better than to tell the story? So, yeah, let's hear the story, man. How did it all start?
Well, Mr. Southpaw, thank you for your lovely and kind opening comments there. So, yeah, it's going back to the dark and stormy days of 1992 when I started it. And it's over time, it's become a little bit of a legendary label, probably because of its lack of sort of background information out there adds to the legend on it. But yeah, 1992 was a really different time to today. You know, it was a time when there was no internet. You couldn't tell if anybody even liked you. You know, you had to go out physically to be hated. You couldn't sit at home and be hated. So going back to 1992, there was no internet. There was no nostalgia market. There was no Britpop even. It was really sort of at the tail end of, it was a tail end of the sort of American Nirvana scene, you know, and Riot Girl and all of those things. They're really sort of a time of anti-pop stars. And I didn't like that. I mean, I had nothing against music, but I've always had this thing where pop stars should look like pop stars, be like pop stars, and sound like pop stars. And so that 1992 period was a really tough time if you like pop music and decent songwriters, etc. So yeah, around about that time, I looked around and I started my own label. I'd been in the music industry already for sort of best part of 4 or 5 years, and I'd worked at Pinnacle. I'd come from a big distributor called Pinnacle before that, where we'd had artists like Kylie Minogue, and we had all that Manchester scene that come through. And it was at that time that I decided, you know, I wanted to leave and create my own label, and a label that was sort of themed. Sort of a stylized label. I was really listening to people like L Records. You know, that's really where I was coming from that time. You know, me and my friends were some of the few people sitting around in London listening to L, listening to XTC, listening to sort of this esoteric pop music. And really, you know, I felt the world really needed that at that time.
Yeah, I love L, man. And yeah, I can definitely hear the L influence on Humbug. Like even down to the artwork. I mean, artwork was such a big part of both labels.
Yeah, and I nicked a couple of the L artists. I'm quite pleased to do so. You know, Philippe came and joined me, and I did some work with Simon Turner, who was the King of Luxembourg. But yeah, for me, I loved that L. I thought, you know, there's probably very few people who were ever listening to it, if I'm being honest. I think it was so specialized, you know. It didn't represent anything else that was going on in the music world at that time, but it just really worked for me. You know, it was so beautiful. And you know, and as much as I'd come from a punk background and I'd come from an electronic background and an indie background, I really like things like the Ink Spots. You know, I love some of those old classic bands, you know, that had just been totally forgotten at that stage. So yeah, when 92 came around, I started to look at acts to sign for Humbug Records, and I just found that there was this whole amazing selection of great British singers-songwriters that just were homeless. You know, they weren't able to make money, they weren't able to get signed, and they certainly weren't able to get any recognition in the media for how great they were. And so to some extent, to be honest, Southpaw, I sort of really had, you know, it was an endless list of people that I could have signed, you know, as an independent at that stage who were homeless. So yeah, I started off, I think the first signing was Captain Sensible. You know, I'd loved the band, you know, for me, they were my childhood band, you know, they were the punks, you know, not the Pistols, they were the real punks. And Captain had split with the Damned at that time. He'd been apart from them for a number of years. He was creating this wonderful, wonderful pop music. I mean, just simply brilliant. that it was almost impossible to get anybody to listen to. That was always the problem with Captain and with Humbug and all of these. It was, you know, a very difficult time to get the media to support you, because at that time there wasn't really the respect shown to the great British artists. There just wasn't that respect shown to them. You know, if there was very much, you've had your day, you know, bugger off and go somewhere else. There could have been if I hadn't have done Humbug, I could have opened this fantastic retirement home for elderly musicians, you know, somewhere in the countryside in England.
Well, that sounds
So
fantastic.
they couldn't wander. You know, we'd have to have people in the grounds to bring them back. Come back, you're wandering.
Oh man, to think of the music being made there, it'd be fantastic.
Yeah, it would be wonderful. We had these wonderful artists. So my first signing was Captain Sensible, who was just a dream to work with. You know, and we went on to make, I think, 4 or 5 albums with Captain over that period of time. It was a very difficult period for Captain. This was the period when he was outside the Damned. Critically, you know, nobody was really taking him, looking at him in a great light at all. We had no internet where you could build a fan base, and you at that time, the newspapers, the Enemy, the Melody Maker, etc. They were really the gatekeepers of the music industry, you know, and they stood there with a great big clipboard, and there was my name and the word Humbug and the word written underneath, double underscored, saying "Do not admit."
I think, yeah, you once referred to Humbug as England's most disliked label.
Oh, I absolutely think so. You know, I mean, one of the artists we had was the great Colin Lloyd Tucker, who'd worked with the Gadgets. He'd formed The at one point with Matt Johnson. I mean, an absolute genius of a man. And he came up with a slogan which really became one of the centre of ground slogans of Humbug, which was 24 people can't be wrong. Because that's how we felt. You know, there was 24 people who probably liked this shit that we were creating, but, you know, those 24 people, myself and the artist included, it really had to work. You know, that's how we had to make it go. You know, there was no stopping it. Those 24 people were critical to me.
Excellent. Colin Lloyd Tucker, very interesting man. You also reissued the Doofy record, him and Simon Fisher Turner, which is such an interesting idea.
Yeah, I think it was one of the earliest sort of alter ego albums where Simon and Colin had created 2 French ladies, and this whole background to them, that they were these legendary recording artists, and they were missing. They'd been missing for years. And in the sleeve notes, we one of the things we always did was extensive sleeves. You know, we probably lost money on every release in a sort of factory kind of way, because some of them were so expensive to press and cutouts from them and things like that. But in the Defee sleeves, we sort of said, where are these girls? If anybody knows where they are, tell us. And I think we ended up getting 4 letters back from people saying, I've seen them, including one from a gentleman who sent a cigarette butt saying, with lipstick on it, saying that I chased after them and they'd left this in the ashtray. It's the only evidence I have, you know. So it was a magical time. You know, I don't know about anybody who bought Humbug, but we were really enjoying ourselves. You know, we were really enjoying ourselves at that time. And so Colin was a really great artist. He also did an album, apart from his solo album with me, or 1 or 2 solo albums with me at Humbug. He also did a great album with Paddy Bush, Kate Bush's brother, called Skylarking. An absolutely superb album, you know, and by anybody, you know, and that was an interesting one because we tried to, the sleeve on it was this mole. It was coming out of the ground, and it was a stuffed mole. You know, we'd hide it from a you know, a shop that
sold stuffed moles.
Sold stuffed moles, like
one of those shops. Yeah,
one of those shops, the mole shop. And we decided we wanted it as a 3D cover, but you had to put it into some form of vacuum to do this. So I think we exploded a mole in this vacuum trying to do this photograph before we realised it was impossible. And we couldn't do this amazing 3D cover of the mole without blowing up the stuffed mole. So by the second mole, he became a normal shot coming out of the ground rather than a stuffed one. So Colin was a great artist and still is a great artist. You know, these were all great people. They really, really were. So we had Colin, and we worked with Paddy. We had Captain, who was superb. Martin Newell, obviously, who's gone on to really become the biggie from the background of the Humbug stable. But believe me, in '92, Martin just couldn't get signed and was at the point of retirement. I pulled him out from retirement and said, Martin, you've got to. I don't know if I can swear, Southpaw, but I said to him, you got to fucking make some more records. This is just madness for you to retire. You know, you're clearly one of the greatest songwriters in this country's ever known. And from that, we produced 2 albums and an EP. The first of those albums was The Greatest Living Englishman,
which you brought them together with Andy Partridge, which
that's
a
correct.
magical combination.
I brought them together with Andy, and that album has now really gone on to be absolutely critically acclaimed. You know, that's one that we always get remembered for. And the follow-up album, the Off-White album, with Louis Philippe, and in between those we had the Let's Kiosk EP as a sort of a stepping stone between the two of them. But yeah, I mean, a true genius. One of Britain's true geniuses, and again now actually recognised as such. You know, it's funny. The Greatest Living Englishman was almost like a seed. You know, it took us. We planted it in 1992. It's sort of 15 years later, it sprouted. You know, and people started going, "This is just unbelievable." And so it was sort of a 15-year germination and sprouting process to it. But yeah, it's now recognised. I think it's into its multiple repress now via Cherry Red. Vinyl is out. I was invited to the premiere of his last documentary on him last year, which was at the cinema. And then I note that there's a new documentary coming up on Martin. So he's going to be a double documentary man within 2 years, and really has gone to be sort of viewed as one of the great British eccentric songwriters of all time.
Rightfully so, yeah. 2 documentaries. That's unusual, but it's definitely worth it, you know.
Yeah, well, there's one called The Jangling Man, I think is the new one, and Upstairs. There's Graham Bendall did a great documentary. Upstairs, I can't remember the full title of it, and I apologise to Graham for not remembering it, but it's a superb documentary on Martin. And so there's another new one to come this year, and it's and Martin, quite rightly, is getting the accolade he always deserved.
Yeah. So tell me about bringing him and Andy Partridge together.
I think that was a case of my 2 friends, Damon and Peter, and me sitting around of an evening getting completely stoned on weed, probably for about a good few years. I was sort of introduced to XTC by my friend Peter, who sadly passed away this year. And myself, Peter and Damon would sit around in my old bedroom. I was still living at home when Humbug was started.
Oh,
and
wow.
We'd sit around of an evening getting stoned and listening to XTC. And it was just, it seemed there was a synergy between the two in the capabilities, you know, in the understanding of music and what they liked. And it seemed like a terribly good excuse to reach out to Andy Partridge and have a conversation with him to begin with. But as I wrote to him, I said to Martin, let's see if we can get Andy involved. And as I wrote to him, it turned out Andy was already a huge fan of Martin from Martin's previous band, The Cleaners from Venus. So it sort of all came together in one. It was the easiest thing to ever do. Absolutely easy. Andy was a complete gentleman. You know, the other guys from XTC were there. They were lovely people. And even when we went on tour, we did a couple of dates with Martin, which are almost a little bit like the legendary Sex Pistols dates, you know, like the 100 Club. You know, there's like 8,000 people claim to have been at the Humbug, at the 100 Club gigs. We did these dates, a couple of dates. We did one in France and we did 2 dates in Japan. Sadly, we didn't do any English dates, which I think now was a mistake, although probably the 24 people would have turned up and no more. But when we did the dates in France and in Japan, Andy couldn't go and doesn't play live, as you know. But Dave Gregory from XTC, who still remains a very good friend of mine to this day, he came along. He played those dates with us as part of an all-star band. Dave Gregory, Captain Sensible, Louis Philippe, Gary Dreadful, who's playing with the Damned at the time, a couple of other great names, Tiv, a couple of other great, Nelson from New Model Army. So it was this great lineup. And Dave Gregory from XTC sort of stood in and took the XTC position in the Martin Newell story of these recordings.
And there's a live album from Japan, right?
There is, yeah. We actually recorded the second show, I think it was. We did one show in Tokyo, one show in Osaka. We did 2 press meetings at HMV where we did big press conferences, and we did I think we did a couple of magazines, and I'm not sure, we may have done a TV program called Okie Dokie. I'm a bit drug-addled from those periods, so I sort of have vague recollections. And then, of course, we did the French show, which was a black session.
Yeah.
Benoit Lenoir, who is the French John Peel. And that show was remarkable because we had people like Jean-Paul Gaultier turn up to watch us, who'd become a massive fan. Yeah. I mean, it was incredible. I mean, this was the incredible thing, to be honest, Southpaw. Hated as we were in the UK and totally misunderstood and not even recognised, and and almost like my artists had their chance and they could all bugger off. When it came to what the outside of the UK, France, America, Japan, they got it. They got Humbug. They got Martin Newell. They got they understood it. They looked at it and said, the French viewed it as incredibly intellectual, and so, we were absolutely adored there, and even when we went to Japan, when we arrived, we'd sort of, I think we'd gone out from England with people throwing stones at us and booing. And literally, when we arrived in Japan, there was people at the airport screaming. It was like, really, it was like the Beatles. It was quite incredible. And we had people follow us all around. I think Martin at the time was writing for The Independent, and he wrote a tour diary of it, which I think you can find in the Independent archives, or Martin will have a copy of it. But every day he wrote the Japanese tour diary, which The Independent published, which is amazing considering probably people are like, what the hell was that about? But we had what we called the Tokyo Duck Patrol, because Captain and Martin would be followed by 10 or 15 sort of late teenage Japanese girls everywhere they went. And Dave, everywhere they went, they'd just be followed through the streets by these people screaming. It was a very weird experience from being disliked.
Yeah. Wow. Excellent. What's really interesting to me is Martin Newell and Mikey Georgeson are my 2 favorite songwriters. David Devant and His Spirit Wife. And I found out both had been on Humbug. It just sort of blew my mind. So tell me about, from what I've heard about, I didn't discover Devant until later because I never really heard of him in America. But from what I heard, those early days were wild.
Well, yeah, that was an interesting one because we actually sort of signed all these, as I say, thinking about the acts we signed, we had people like TV Smith from the Adverts, we had Reckless Eric signed, we had Louis Philippe, Colin Lloyd Tucker, Phil Schoenfeld, etc. All of them had an established history. And then as we sort of grew towards the end of Humbug, we took on 2 new acts, which were Gretchen Hoffner. In fact, there were 3 new acts, I'll tell a lie. One was Pictures of Tom, one was Gretchen Hoffner, and one was David Devant and His Spirit Wife. And I'd I can't even remember where I first saw David Devant, but they really blew me away. They were really, Britpop had arrived by that stage. It was just the beginning of Britpop, Jarvis was getting recognition, etc. And we sort of signed David Devant. And they, to me, were always like the Grumbleweeds of Britpop, So they were a great band. I really loved their recordings, their material. And we did one single with them called Pimlico. And then we demoed an album with them. And unfortunately, we lost them at that stage to Arista. I think one of the problems with Humbug is I really hated having artists contractually tied down. It just felt really wrong, like enslavement. And by the time we got Pimlico out and David Devant were picking up traction with the press, you can't blame them at all, their manager at that point. They were like, thank you very much. Arista are offering us a blank check. Thank you and good night. And they went on to do work with Arista and did an album. But the demos that we actually did, which I think they've released at some point, The Lost World of David Devant, are far better in my opinion, than the later albums. They're far rougher and rawer, and they show the songwriting capabilities, etc., far better than the Arista material. But yeah, a really great band from that time, and probably. There's probably a finite time with those as well at that moment, because they were sort of almost viewed a little bit like a novelty act as well, because they were so visual. You know, it was an incredibly visual band. But there's some really, really amazing songs like Light on the Surface. You know, I absolute respect for them. Wonderful band.
You never had, I mean, aside from The Greatest Living Englishman, I think you never had artists demo anything for you. You just trusted them.
No, I absolutely, well, funny enough, David Devant, yeah, I absolutely dislike the concept of demoing stuff, because, I can't play any instruments at all. You know, I literally probably couldn't even play a tambourine. And I always felt, from my early days in the music industry, I realized the industry was full of frustrated musicians. I mean, absolutely full of frustrated musicians. And I always felt it was better not to be one of those and to be the industry side of it. And so for me, I just had total faith and didn't really need demos, and didn't feel like I needed them, or didn't feel like I needed to pin the artist down with the demos. Saying that, Martin may have a different recollection, but with Martin, what happened is, I'll tell you the story of signing Martin in a minute, which is an interesting story in its own right. But when I said to Martin I'd like to do an album with him, he said, yeah, brilliant. And then I think he comes to the office about 2 days later with all the demos. And I was like, well, you don't need to demo it. You can go and play whatever, you go and play the spoons on it, whatever I have total faith, But he demoed it. And again, from that, what an amazing album. I don't think we demoed any of the other albums. We didn't demo the Off-White album. We didn't demo the EPs. It was only The Greatest Living Englishman. But that would have helped Andy anyway. And I'm sure that was part of Martin's thought process on it.
Yeah, I remember Martin telling me that he sent those demos to Andy, and Andy said, we've got half an album here. And Martin, pissed Martin off, but then he went and wrote a couple of more real solid songs, making that album as great as it is.
I think it's a funny album, The Greatest Living Englishman. In fact, it's the same with the Off-White album. In fact, it's the same with all of Martin's albums and material. There isn't one bad song. Every single track on that is something I was deeply proud to release, And when I started, so how I came about signing him is when I set up Humbug, Andy McQueen, who was a great music industry person, he had a label with Captain Sensible called Deltic Records, which had Martin Newell signed on as the Brotherhood of Lizards, which was a band him and Nelson, who went on to be a New Model Army, were in. And so I'd actually originally signed Captain. And so me, Captain, and Andy went off to see Johnny Moped one evening. And the support was Martin. Martin, I didn't really know him from The Cleaners from Venus. I knew him from the Brotherhood of Lizards. And Martin, we all went for Chinese afterwards. And I just got speaking to Martin. I said, I've got to sign you. I really got to sign you. I love the Brotherhood of Lizard stuff. So it really came about from going off to see a Johnny Moped gig in the Chinese afterwards with all of us. And then I think that was probably on the Friday, and on the Monday, Martin turned up with the demos, So it was, Martin may recall it differently. I recall it literally being that quick.
Excellent.
So yeah, and again, it's, it was a great move. And Andy Partridge was a wonderful man to work with. I mean, a truly gentleman, a beautiful human being. And it was a difficult time for Andy because, I think Martin's spoken about this, and Andy probably has as well. And I feel quite comfortable telling you it, but we were recording at Andy's house. And at the time, Andy was going through a divorce with his wife, who was still there in the house.
I heard that.
And it would be, tell Andy I'm doing this, tell Andy I'm going out or whatever. No one would talk to each other in the house. And I think in some extent that may have helped the album, because it may have got Andy just to go, I'm not interested in what the fuck's going on there, and I'm just going to put my head, heart and soul into this. So yeah, but it was quite strange because of that situation as well at the time.
Now, having all these eccentric geniuses on the label, what was that like? Was it trouble of reining them in and doing stuff, or it seemed more like a family to me?
Oh yeah, very much. Yeah, I like that Andy Warhol factory mentality. So where everyone worked together. So Reckless Eric would turn up, and he'd always bring a jar of homemade jam to the office. And that's what it was about. It wasn't about drugs. It wasn't about rock and roll. It was about homemade jam. That was Humbug, homemade jam. And so it was like a family. So we got everybody to work with each other where we could. We got, Louis Philippe did the second Martin Newell album, produced it brilliantly. And then we had everybody just working with everybody in some way or other. And we were very good. Whenever we made any money, we threw these ridiculous parties. We always did that. We always did the music industry's first Christmas party, which was always in June. And we'd hire snow machines, and we'd hire rodeo reindeer, and we'd have Father Christmas coming in, and Steve Strange would always turn up as well. He was a great friend of mine. I did some management for at the time. So he'd be like, shall I hire a camel? Was a conversation once. Shall I hire a camel and ride to it on a camel? I remember that conversation going on. So we had these wonderful Christmas parties. Monty, this great artist Monty. I don't know if you've ever listened to Monty recordings. I mean, absolutely brilliant. He'd come from the Dubious Brothers, who'd had a number of albums out, played at Glastonbury. He'd be there, so it was like this big family do. Always a big family do. None of the artists ever argued with each other. They all supported each other, every single one of them. It was really beautiful. I think nobody was really, it was such difficult times for a lot of these artists, particularly the older ones, that there wasn't the competition between them. There was these huge levels of respect. T.V. Smith, what a genius songwriter. And these, so there was history between all of these artists before I picked them up, or in many cases there was. But they worked together beautifully, to be honest.
Excellent.
Big family. I remember one party we did, and I think myself and my ex-wife had stayed up late at night making many dope cakes, hash cakes, which were put into the buffet without warning, as I remember it. And so you'd have these monumental. It's a pity we didn't film everything that went on. It was just quite marvelous.
There was talk of a Humbug movie, though, right?
Well, I think that's one thing that I may even return to one day, which is I always wanted to make a Humbug movie. And it's called Sometimes the Devil Dresses as a Gentleman. Sometimes I Dress as an Englishman. Nice. And I only know the last scene of it, which is the SAS in their full breathing apparatus with their machine guns and everything, all dressed in black, standing there singing Jerusalem as a choir. But in this, you can hardly make out what they're saying because of the breathing apparatus. So you have sort of 20 men dressed in black with machine guns and ready and breathing apparatus masks going. I know that is the ending of the movie, and so somehow I have to one day make that movie and finish it off and have that scene. That's too good a scene never to be not made.
Yeah. Now the title, I mean, the look was very important to you as well. You were always a big fan of the top hat.
It goes back to my dislike of anti-pop stars. I grew up sort of in the 70s, glam rock, etc., like we all did, and loved all of that stuff. And so to me, a musician had to look like a musician. When you walk down the street, don't be anonymous. Walk down the street so people turn and go, fucking hell, look at that. That's a musician. So, yeah, I think the instant I signed Martin actually was because he wore a top hat. So I was just like, you're wearing a top hat, you're signed, right? You don't demo anything. Don't even tell me your name. I don't even know if you can play music. We're wearing a top hat, you're signed. So for me, yeah, I didn't like an anonymity of artists. Pop stars had to look like pop stars, and that was really important to me. They just look fantastic. All of the artists look just superb, just like proper pop stars as I remember them. Glitter in their hair, badly put on makeup. That they may have borrowed from their mum's books. That's how it had to be at that time, and it's still important to me that I still dislike the anti-pop star look. I like a pop star to be a pop star. And so it was dress and style was important to me. And Martin, as you basically see him on the sleeve of the greatest living Englishman, is pretty much how I first met Martin dressed, and it's like, you're signed. And Nell was the same. I think he was Nelson, when he was with him, was in coattails. You signed. If anybody could find a makeup box and some dressing up box or whatever, they'd get signed by Humbug at that stage.
Now, like all the great iconic indie labels like Elle, Sarah, Postcard, Humbug only lasted a few years.
Well, of course, it can only be that way.
Yeah.
Because if you try to make any business sense out of it, you just would never do it. So what you do is, you do two things, which people like Elle in particular did, which is you try to work a catalogue in the background alongside this to keep it financed as much as you can. So you try to work on some older albums, on some side labels, just to bring money in all the time and keep it going. And like all labels, there's only a finite life in this. It may be different now. If you set up Humbug now, you'd have a very different run because of the internet. It's like if I go onto a damned website, like in all my life before the internet, I probably met 6 people who like the Damned. 6, probably, right? And if I go onto the internet now, there's about 7,500, right, that I could speak to instantly. It was impossible to connect with people in those days, especially if you were ignored by the press, and they really disliked us. They really viewed us as, what the fuck are you doing? These people are old people. There's new generations. The press was trying to sell to 18-year-old kids and whatever. They didn't want 40-year-old men, telling them this is how pop should be played. So it was a really different ball game. And, I think we got 2 or 3 letters of how wonderful Martin was, literally 2 or 3. I don't think we got a review in the UK. We employed this wonderful guy, Des, who did all the press for us, and it must have been like the most thankless task ever. You might as well just come in with some concrete and bricks and built a little wall on his desk and then just hit his head on it all day for 8 hours and then go home. That would have been more productive, But, and say, I can't emphasize enough, the pre-internet days, it was really impossible to find a fan base and seal a fan base, particularly in the UK. As I say, once you go outside the UK, we've got brilliant reviews in Japan, brilliant reviews in America. Really, no disrespect, Mr. Southpaw, for your gentlemen colleagues over there, but the Americans were getting this way before the English were, way before the English were. The French were getting it way before the English were, So, and the Japanese were getting it way before the English were. It was just the English that just were not getting Humbug. They just couldn't find them out there. Very few people were listening to it. Most of our product was going abroad.
Wow.
Difficult times, strange times. It's very difficult to remember what the world was like before the internet. Yeah. But it was a lonely place. It was a lonely place. You could put a record out, go to the sort of 6 major publications that were around at the time, The Enemy, Melody Maker, Etcetera, Etcetera, Etcetera. And if they told you to piss off, you were then down to sort of 12 fanzines after that had any reasonable circulation who might give you a fighting chance, and John Peel, if he wanted to pick up on it. But that wasn't even a set piece at the time, because he was very much into the grunge and the anti-pop style thing. So we again weren't really doing what John Peel wanted.
Wow.
Yeah, it's really difficult, very difficult, It's quite amazing we last 5 years, And we could have continued. I think we could have continued, but I sort of met with the artists at that stage. Martin had got exhausted by me at that stage because, if you take someone like Martin, which is quite an easy example, Martin was coming back from Japan to his local pub in Wivenhoe and sort of like, I've got a huge accolade over there, but I'm not selling records or whatever, and so it's a really difficult time for those artists, to have accolade abroad, no accolade in the UK. Really, we didn't make any money. And so I think it got to about 5 years into it, something like that. And I thought, okay, I've done it. I've got to now move on and be a little bit more sensible, if that's the right word. Less risky. I don't think sensible is the right word. I don't think less risky is the right word. I don't think grown up's the right word. And I'll probably never know what the right word is. But I had to I had to sort of alter it at that stage. So I met with the artist and said, look, we just can't continue. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass the whole catalogue over to Cherry Red, who can absorb it within their company, keep those releases out there, make sure you guys are paid, and make sure that they live on in the beautiful way that they should have always lived on. So yeah, that was really sort of the stage it got to, which is, you know, you had to sort of say, okay, stop at this stage.
Which is good, because then you had it as a thing that existed in a wonderful way, not
Yeah,
something that dragged on.
I agree with you. And look, and again, as I say, we're going back to Elle. Let's chat Elle for a minute, because I loved Elle, but I sort of think that once it got to a stage, there's still Elle releases now.
Right, but after a stage, it wasn't Elle anymore.
It wasn't Elle. It wasn't Elle. That's what I feel. Yeah. After a stage, it was like, well, we got the name, we'll put other releases to it, but you'd sort of lost what Elle to me meant. And so to have continued on, I'd have had to start going, okay, let's put some stuff into Humbug that really isn't Humbug, but can make money, and etc., etc., etc. So for me, I think that was the stage where I had to go, better to stop now. And there is a purity to what we've done. And we haven't compromised on what we've done, and we've done everything we want to do. We failed beautifully in the way that we always knew we'd fail, in a Tony Wilson-esque way. And, you know, and so let's stop at this stage and maybe we'll come back and do a film. You know, maybe at one point we'll return and do this movie, which I still like to do.
When did you come up with the name Humbug? Probably should ask that at the beginning.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, I actually can't tell you where I came up with it. I can't remember how we came up with the name Humbug. The logo was drawn by my ex-wife, Julie, who'd studied graphic art. So she did the frog in the top hat. From the beginning, there you go. We're back to top hats again. We're back to top hat. Maybe it should have been Top Hat Records. And I was quite amazed that nobody had taken Humbug. I remember that before, thinking, well, there's nobody used the name Humbug for a label. Brilliant. And then we could have these great logos off of it, you know, like if it ain't Humbug, it ain't worth a suck, you know, and things like that, based on the old stiff ones. And so we could build some great connotations of different things out the name Humbug. And it just seemed like the most beautiful working name that really worked with it, you know.
I love how the catalog numbers were all Ba. And then
absolutely. Yeah. Bar Humbug. And I was never an Ebenezer Scrooge. It just, again, maybe that's it. Humbug with Ebenezer Scrooge wearing a top hat. Maybe the link to all of this is a top hat somewhere. Yeah, I think it could be. You know, you go to Ebenezer Scrooge and I sort of envisage him in a top hat. So maybe that's even where it come from. But I can't remember where the exact name came from. And I don't remember playing with any other names. I remember that just being the first name. Yeah, it's going to be Humbug. Bang, 92, and straight out there as Humbug. So yeah, great times. And we ended up signing an American gentleman as well, David Yazbek, who Andy Partridge introduced me to. He was a really big fan. And there's a great album on Humbug, if you ever come across it, Dave Yazbek's album.
I haven't heard that one. Wow.
No, and also the Humbug sampler is always worth looking at, called Humbuggery. I noticed that is often up for sale on eBay, and that's got Dave Yazbek on it. It's got a selection from all the artists on there. And some guest artists like the great Paul Bevois as well, who's on there, you know. So
I like his.
So he sort of joined us on Humbug for that compilation as well, you know. And probably if I'd have kept Humbug going, I'd have worked very hard to steal Mr. Bevois to join us as well, you know.
I like his records. I haven't heard them in a while. I'm gonna pull those out today.
Yeah, they're lovely.
Yeah.
Do you know what I really liked about him? What was his band? Was it the Jet Set?
I think so.
Yeah, his early band was a Jet Set, if I remember rightly. And what he did is he based them a little bit on the Monkees. So they got a car and they did it all up with the Jet Set, and they'd have all these photos of him hanging out the car. And his releases would have collectible bubblegum cards with them, and you know, and I really love that. I really felt that, you know, you should instantly be a pop star. Don't pretend to be a pop star. Don't build up to being a pop star. You are a pop star. Be a pop star. You know, and so Paul Bevois had that sort of principle and philosophy as well. So, you know, again, a great artist. There's so many great artists during that period who just sort of like floating around in the ether, unsigned.
Excellent. That's all my questions. You got anything else you want to add about the label or anything? Anything you?
try and think. As I say, I think it was a really beautiful period in time for me, to be honest, Mr. Southpaw. I enjoyed every minute of it. I think it was without a business plan, which probably the best labels are, and that's why they're finite. And I think that if I had took enough drugs, I'd probably do it all again.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show, Kevin.
Mr. Southpaw, it's an absolute pleasure to you, and give my regards to everyone in the colonies from here.
Will do.
And you look after yourself in these troubled times. And just remember, only pop music can save the world. Even more important than ever today. 92, it was important, but at this moment, music is the most beautiful thing that we all share between us. And it's the one thing that can unite us all in troubled times. It can get us through the deepest and darkest problems, and it can bring us all together again.
Excellently said.